Chris is the program director for the Nature Conservancy's Eastern Nebraska project in Aurora, Nebraska. Oversees the management and restoration of approximately 5,000 acres of TNC land, as well as research and conservation programs for most of the eastern third of the state. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. So I want to talk today about what we can do about one of the largest challenges that we face in conservation, which is the loss and fragmentation of habitat. So if you have a landscape that is large and intact and then becomes broken into little pieces, whether that's because of cropland conversion or other things, you end up with these little small isolated patches of habitat, which creates a lot of challenges for the species that live there. And restoration can just mean doing an incremental change to make some of those patches a little bit more viable for species and communities to survive. So it doesn't necessarily mean trying to restore an entire landscape. It can just mean trying to make little patches of habitat a little bit bigger so that birds or butterflies or whatever's living there can have bigger populations and have a better chance of surviving any kind of incident that might threaten them. Or you might do the same kind of strategy as a way to reduce the edge exposure for species that don't do well near edges, or to reduce the influx of invasive species pressure, that kind of thing. You can also reconnect remnants together so that populations now can interact in a way that they hadn't before, exchange individuals or exchange genetic information. And sometimes that reconnection can happen just by adding more habitat to the landscape so that there's more habitat stepping stones for species to move around, and you don't have to have them adjacent to each other all the time. And when you're doing that kind of restoration, I think I like thinking about it in terms of being different than the restoration work you might do with a historic building, or, for example, a car that you're trying to make look exactly like it used to at some point in history. Because in that kind of a project, you're using, if you can, the original materials, and you want it to look exactly like it used to, so you have a very clearly defined final product. And I think that's different than what we usually think about with ecological restoration. I think ecological restoration is more like what we're trying to do with a city after a big disaster, whether it's a hurricane or something else. Because at that point, what you care about most is not making it look exactly like it did. You care about restoring function, restoring services. So housing, food, transportation, communication, law enforcement, whatever those services are. You want to get everybody back online so that the community members can survive and thrive. And so the final product there is very flexible. It's the function that matters. And that's where I think that's a better analogy or better metaphor for what we're trying to do with ecological restoration. And so if that's the goal, I think plant diversity becomes really important, because plant diversity adds up to a lot of the other things that make function and services exist. But that's not the only objective. So maybe that's the objective. Maybe your objective for a restoration project is to do that, is to enlarge and reconnect prairies. And if it is, you want to try to maximize plant diversity, and you want to be strategic in the location of your restorations so that they set up in a way that they connect or enlarge other pieces that are already existing. But you might just say, well, we just want better pollinator habitat out there. So what we care about is having a lot of flowers that are blooming at all times of the year. So you have whatever time of the year it is, you have several species of flowers that are blooming and available for all different kinds of pollinators that might be there. You might not need as much plant diversity, and the location is a little bit more flexible because they don't necessarily have to be next to a remnant to be valuable in some way to pollinators. If you're interested in grassland birds, most of them need, fairly large patches of habitat, but they don't necessarily need plant diversity. They need some sort of herbaceous structure that's managed with fire, grazing, mowing, whatever it is, so that each of the bird species can find the type of habitat structure that it wants for nesting or for brood rearing or whatever it needs. And then you might have a different objective, which is more about education, outreach, connecting people to nature. And in that case, your major objectives might line up with things like We want it to look nice, we want it to look safe, we want it to look accessible, and we want to interpret what we're seeing there. And again, you might not need to go with 180 or 200 plant species to make it work for that objective. You need it to be pretty, and you need it to be a place where people want to come and see butterflies or bees or whatever it is they're looking for. And then there's lots of other options. So regardless of what you're doing from a restoration standpoint, one of the first steps is to figure out where you're going to get the seed or the plant material for that restoration. And one of the questions that always comes up with that is, how far away from the site do you want to stray to get the genetics for the seed or the plants that you're going to use? And there are people who feel very strongly that you shouldn't go more than, say, 10 or 20 miles, and make sure you're getting the local ecotype seed that's adapted to that specific part of the world. And then there's the sort of an opposite extreme that's being bandied about now, which is the climate matching idea, which talks about things like, if you're in Western Missouri, but you think 50 years from now, Western Missouri is going to look like Northern Texas or wherever. Maybe you go to Northern Texas and you say, well, let's figure out what the communities look like down there and maybe bring plant material from that far away and try to build a system that's going to be, adapted to the future rather than to the current situation. I'm not quite comfortable with that extreme at this point, but I also understand the argument for it. I think there's a middle ground, which is what's called regional admixtures. And the idea with that is that you kind of expand beyond your 10 or 20 miles and you try to get seed from a lot of different populations within a region relatively close to where you are, but that represent a wider diversity of genetic material, so that you can sort of expand the adaptability or the resilience of the community that you're restoring. And there aren't any rules for that. And a lot of us, I think, have been doing that for a long time and just not calling it that necessarily. But I do think that's a really interesting discussion. And it's something we're going to be learning a lot about, I think, in the next 10 or 20 years. And hopefully, we'll be able to give each other better advice in a couple of decades about what to do. But for now, we just have to guess and do the best we can. So regardless of what you decide on that, you have to get seed from somewhere for these restoration projects. You can harvest it yourself by hand or by machine, or you can purchase the seed. And either one is a great option depending on how you're set up. I'm going to talk mostly about harvesting your own seed because that's what I'm used to. And if you're purchasing seed, a lot of those decisions are being made for you other places. So if you purchase seed, stick with me while I talk about harvesting. We'll get back to other things. We have a seed harvester that we like on the Platte River prairies where I've done most of my restoration work. And I'm not advocating for this one. I'm using it as an example of a way to be more efficient with some kinds of seed harvest. So the guy pictured here is named Ned Grells. He has built these machines for the last, 15 years or so for us and a bunch of other people. So it's a motorized machine that has a kind of like a grass harvester or a rice head for a combine. It's got the shell-borne fingers that strip seeds off and dump them in a hopper behind the machine as you pull it through the prairie with a four-wheeler or an ATV or UTV or a truck or whatever. It's great for getting large quantities of species that are sort of in big quantities all in one place. It doesn't replace hand harvesting, but it does help for us pick up things for projects where we need a lot of some species, whether that's warm season grasses or sedges for a wet meadow project or whatever. And so, within a short amount of time, you can fill the back of a pickup truck with sawtooth sunflower seeds or Maximilian sunflower seeds in this case. But that's not the only way to do it. And we've done a lot of restoration on my sites with, 180 to 200 species mixes, planting up to 200 acres a year, where most of that seed comes from hand harvesting. And one of the keys to that is to be really efficient in terms of being organized, having a list, for example, of what species are you looking for, where are you going to find them, when are they normally ready? And then as the season goes on, you sort of update that checklist or that database so that when it's time, you know what you're going to be harvesting this week, where it's going to be, where you've seen good numbers of those plants and where the seed looks good. And then it's basically just about harvest efficiency. So You try to find big populations of plants. You strap buckets or bags to your waist so you can use both hands, and you grab big handfuls of stuff while you're there, and you clean it later because you're not going to get a second chance at the field portion. You can always take time later to process the seed and clean it up and separate things out. But try to get as much as you can. And again, you try to find multiple seed sources where the species is abundant so that you get genetics from multiple places, but you're not spending a lot of time, hopefully, picking out one plant every 100 yards and trying to harvest enough to be useful. Sometimes you have to because that's how the plant grows. But where you can, choose sites where there's a lot of that species around. The other thing to think about is it can be really good to spread out the seed harvest for a particular species over a couple of weeks, because that also increases your genetic diversity potentially, because you get the ones that are blooming early and the ones that are blooming late, rather than just harvesting everything that's happened to be blooming and ripe at the particular time that you're out there. And then a lot of people are using nursery plugs or transplants or buy-in plugs or whatever. I'm not going to get into all that, but there are ways to either produce more seed by putting some of your seed into a greenhouse, growing them into plugs, making production plots, or to grow out plugs and then transplant them directly in. If there's something that you are limited on in terms of how much seed you can get, like violets can be really difficult to get a large quantity of seed. And so we've done in the past where we've grown violets in the greenhouse and then planted them out as plants rather than seed. Or something like the bottom right here, which is sun sedge, Carex heliophila, which is a species we've just never gotten to grow from seed. And I don't know of anybody else that ever has either. It produces seed for some reason, but it doesn't seem to germinate in a way that we can figure out. But it spreads really nicely by rhizomes, and it's really common on some of our sandy sites. And so we just dig them up out of the ground and kind of dig little plugs from here and there, move them out into the restoration sites, and they establish pretty well for us. There's all kinds of ways to deal with seed once you have it. The most important thing is to let it dry, obviously, so it doesn't get moldy. Whether you clean it dramatically or not is going to depend a lot on what you're doing for planting equipment or techniques. We normally just do a little bit of screening to get some of the bigger chunks out. We run it through a hammer mill to break everything apart. We have actual hammer mills, but we also have this monster machine in the middle here that is an old grasshopper lawnmower, sort of rebuilt into a machine that just pulls seeds through a hose into the fan, busts them up in the steel fan blades, and then puts them in the hopper in the back. It's very quick, it's very efficient, works really well. And also, by the way, scarifies seeds like prairie clover or lead plant that actually germinate better if they run through a machine where they get scraped up a little bit. And we can adjust the throttle to, be more careful with seeds that are more fragile. Anyway, and then this might be the most important piece of the restoration process if you're trying to plant a new place, which is your site prep. And it's really important to be thoughtful about this, sometimes several years ahead. And that's not always possible based on funding or the way a project is set up. But, if you have an existing plant cover there, especially if it's an invasive species like smooth brome or fescue or something you're planting into, making sure that's well and truly dead and that you've tried to eliminate as much of the seed bank as you can really helps slow down the road. And I think that's fairly obvious, although I've definitely messed that up where I've not spent enough time prepping the site. And if I would have spent another year or two killing it repeatedly, we would have had better luck. But I think the other piece that's important to remember is that it's also looking at the landscape around the site, whether that's the fence line edges or the neighbor's property where there's a grove of Siberian elms that have been dropping seeds into this for years. Anything you can do to remove some of those invasives or the pathways that they come in ahead of time can really make a big difference down the road in terms of success. And again, that's something that takes time and planning, which we don't always have, but if you have the time, boy, is it worth, investing if you can. And then seed mixing, putting together different mixes for different habitat types. We often will, along the Platte River sites, we'll have wetlands and mesic prairies and sort of dry ridge prairies. And so we'll make a separate mix for each of those, but then we'll also combine those mixes together. We kind of feather the differences between those sites because sometimes the line between mesic and wet is really fuzzy. And there will be wet sites out in the middle of the mesic that we don't always know about. So we'll put wetland seed into our mesic mix, We'll put mesic seed into our dry mix, and then we spread it out over the site. So we're still concentrating the seed where it's probably most abundant or most appropriate, but we don't make solid lines in terms of how we mix those. And then seeding rates are really site specific. So I'm going to share two examples here. On the Platte River Prairies, where the Nature Conservancy works, where I've been doing restoration for a long time, we use very light seeding rates. So 2 to 4 pounds of PLS for grass and a couple of pounds of PLS forb seed. The PLS is pure live seed. And we do that because of a couple things. One, we're not using a lot of grass seed because we want the forbs to have a chance to establish before the grasses become dominant. But we're also doing it because we can. It allows us to do more acres with less seed, and we don't have in our landscape, we don't have a situation where we feel like we have to hurry to get things to establish. So if it takes 5 or 6 years for a restored prairie to really come and fully online, for everything to be there and establish and to sort of thicken up, that's great. We have no issue with that because we're not fighting weeds in the meantime that are difficult to control. It's mostly annuals that just sort of back off gradually. But on the other end of that spectrum would be a place like the Nachusa grasslands in Illinois, where that Nature Conservancy site is using 50 pounds of bulk seed per acre, mostly forbs, which is 5 to 10 times what we're using on the Platte. And they use very little seed from Indian grass, big blue stem, or switchgrass. So they use a lot of prairie drop seed, a lot of little blue stem, kind of the bunch grasses, June grasses, things like that. And then they use lots and lots and lots of forb seed. And then their idea is they want to sort of very quickly have a takeover of that site by native species. So the more seed they put out, the more response they get, because they're worried about what would come in the meantime if they don't do it quickly. So they fight sweet clover or bird's foot trefoil, crown vetch, all these other species. And so they can establish a thick community very fast. Then they have less of the invasives, and then they'll also invest a lot of time in going out and patrolling those sites pretty drastically sometimes to make sure that they're either hand weeding or spot spraying those species during the first few years. So seeding rate depends on what you're fighting. A lot of times there's a lot of local knowledge that sort of dictates what people do. But as I talk about in a minute, it's also helpful to experiment. If you've got the time to do a project over several years, you might try some different seeding rates early and see what works, and then you can do the bulk of the site with that method that you come up with. And then, like I mentioned earlier, cleaning seed really depends on how you're going to plant. All of our sites have been broadcast seeding. So I've done 1,500 acres or so broadcast, either with a machine like the one on the left, which is it's called a drop spreader. It's a fertilizer spreader, or that is sometimes used for planting alfalfa or turnips or things with small seeds. And it basically just is a box with a hole in the bottom and an agitator inside that turns when the wheels turn. And then you can adjust the size of the holes to decide how much seed you put out. That works really great. You can pull it behind a truck or a tractor or a UTV. But we've also done a lot of planting by hand, using volunteers or staff, just basically throwing seed out on the ground, often in the snow, but not always. And there's nothing wrong with drilling seed. Any way you can get that seed into the ground is fine, and get that seed soil contact, which is so important. You don't want to bury seeds too deep, obviously, but and that's where drilling can sometimes be problematic. But I wanted to also share that there's a group of us called the Grassland Restoration Network, which has been going on since it's about 20 years now. It's kind of a loose affiliation of restoration sites across the country, mostly Great Plains and Midwest. And we get together every year at a different site, and we just sort of share ideas and methods. We were in Illinois this year, just a couple of weeks ago. And about 10 years ago, we got together and we said, are there methods that we all find to be successful, that we can tell people that, you can do restoration a lot of ways, but here is a set of methods that we've used that really never fail unless something extreme happens. And I didn't actually expect that to work, but we did find 3 things. So planting in the dormant season, broadcast seeding, and seeding into soybean stubble. We found that all of us had success. There wasn't anybody in this room. There was a bunch of sites represented from across a wide geography. There wasn't anybody who said a dormant season broadcast seeding into soybean stubble won't work. It's a consistent method that always works. And again, it doesn't mean that there aren't other methods that can work. but everybody felt comfortable about that, which I thought was pretty powerful, which is why I'm bringing it up. So once you get your seed in the ground, you have to worry about weeds or not worry about weeds depending on your site. So this is a couple of pictures of restorations that we have done here in Nebraska where we have not mowed weeds. And you can see that photo on the right. It looks pretty dark underneath that ragweed and that weed cover. But what we found is that when we do mow weeds, we don't get any different results than when we don't mow weeds. And it's a lot cheaper, obviously, to not mow weeds. So we just don't. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't in other situations. And that's, again, where local knowledge and experimentation really makes a big difference. What we find is that as long as we have kind of dappled light coming through those weeds and hitting the ground, that the weeds are either innocuous or even potentially beneficial in terms of, conserving moisture or providing some cover for those new plants to establish. But again, that's very different in other places where weed cover is a major threat to the establishment of a site. So in a lot of places, mowing even several times a year during the first year or several years can make a big difference. So now I've mentioned this several times, but it's, I think, really, really important, regardless of at what stage you are in your career or your project or whatever. We always try in any project we do to do a little bit of experimentation so that we always learn something every time we do a new project. And sometimes that is fairly extreme where we'll do a project in 3 pieces and we'll try 3 different techniques and really have a side-by-side comparison of all 3 of those. That's pretty rare now that we've been doing this for a long time. What's more common is we might say, let's just take 3 acres in the middle of this big project and we're going to plant those 3 patches differently. Maybe we're trying a different seeding rate. Maybe we're trying a different kind of mix where we use a different ratio of grasses to forbs. Or, people are playing around with things like, what if we add more black-eyed Susan and common evening primrose and some of these sort of short-lived opportunistic plants? Do we get less weed pressure and a better establishment by adding those sorts of anything like that you can experiment with? And it's not something you necessarily have to collect data on. It's just something you do it differently. You go out and look at it 3 or 4 years later. Does it look any different? What can we learn from that? And then you roll that into what you do next or what other people around you might do. And then I guess connected to that would be the idea, again, that if you're doing a large project, I think it's really important, even if you have a lot of experience in that landscape, if you can do it, to break it up into pieces and do small restorations early, where maybe the first several years you just do a few acres at a time, you're testing seed mixes, maybe you're building up seed sources, you're figuring out what your weed pressure is going to be like, all those sorts of things. And then as you start to get a feel for how things work, you can do a little bit larger blocks. And then you get to say, okay, well, we can do 80 acres at a time and we can manage the weed pressure. We feel like we can get the seed harvesting we need to cover 80 acres at a time. And you do 80-acre blocks until you finish the project or whatever that number is, right? I've seen a lot of projects fail. And most of the time, those large projects fail. It's either because they didn't do a good job of site prep, or they underestimated the time and effort it was going to take to deal with the invasive species that came in after the restoration was started. Those, I think, are the 2 most common ways that I've seen things fail. And so, again, the way to fix that is to take it a little bit at a time until you get comfortable with what you're going to need, and then you can really go. So I want to talk a little bit about mistakes that I've made, mistakes that I've seen other people make. Some of those are going to be really general. And I've talked about some of them already, which is, site prep, not only on the site itself, but also in adjacent areas. So we have Siberian elms as a major threat in our landscape, and I've seen a lot of CRP plantings especially fail because of these dog hair stands of Siberian elms that come in. Sometimes that's hard to avoid. But other times, we have definitely had sites where the Siberian elms were on our property, and there was a crop field next to those elms, and we cut the elms down the same year we did the new restoration project, but the seed was already in the site, and it just all popped up at the same time, and we ended up with a forest of Siberian elm trees. Where if we would have cleared those Siberian elm trees 3 years earlier and then continued to farm that site for a few more years and then did the restoration project, we probably would have had very little issue with Siberian elms. And And I didn't have any excuse for the time. The biggest issue or the biggest example of that I can think of, we just didn't do it right. It wasn't that we were pressed for finances or any other things besides just me being impatient. I think the same thing can happen with things like grassed waterways or, again, field edges where you have brome or fescue or elms or anything along those lines. Anything you can clean up well ahead of time will save you a lot of issues down the road. And I want to focus now on this particular restoration project, just because I think there's a lot here. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly, but the overall project is there's a stream that runs through the Platte River prairies. It meanders a lot, but in the early 1920s or so, it was they started sand and gravel mining along the creek, and they basically just mined out the entire creek valley or floodplain and created a long lake, sandpit lake. Over time, that stream started to fill back in. It started to bring sediment in, and it kind of filled in. So site 1 on this map is actually restored by itself. Just that was a sandpit lake. And over time, the stream kind of kept bringing sediment in, kind of filled it in, and created pretty decent habitat, but it was full of trees and really steep banks and not ideal for some of our objectives, things like shorebirds or plant diversity. So the second piece here was the first stage of restoration, where we took that sandpit lake, and there was a bunch of spoil sand all around it. And basically what we did is we took out the trees and we just pushed the spoil sand around and filled in a lot of the lake and tried to create more shallow wetland habitat and recreate a stream channel that was meandering through that site. And then the third piece, we did the same thing, but much later. So at the time that this photo was taken, I showed you this so that you can see kind of what that sandpit lake looked like, with big piles of spoil and a lot of water that was like 8 or 9 feet deep and a lot of trees along the edge. So here's an in-process photo showing what the first stage looked like right after construction. So again, this is just big bulldozers pushing sand around mostly. And this is one of the stretches of the creek that we recreated. That project worked really well. We got good restoration work. We planted it. Everything came in. We were pretty happy with it. So we said, okay, now let's take on this bigger piece. And we basically did the same thing. We started pushing all the sand in. And what we figured out pretty quickly was there's a lot of sludge and sediment at the base of that, or at the bottom of that wetland. And as we pushed the sand in, the sand went down to the bottom and kind of pushed the sludge up. And what we ended up with this big canal in the middle full of this horrible quicksand organic sludge that we didn't know what to do with. And so we had to stop the project and kind of think about how we're going to deal with this. What we ended up doing was bringing in a long arm excavator, pulling the sludge out, spreading it out over the site the best we can, or the best we could, hoping that some of it would biodegrade. A year later or two, we disked it a couple of times to try to, keep breaking it up. But we were really concerned about how much, kind of nutrient load we were going to have and what that was going to do with our weeds. It ended up okay. It ended up much better than I thought. We did have some weed pressure, but it was manageable. And the overall restoration project turned out fairly well, especially in terms of the structure of the habitat. So here's an aerial photo that kind of shows the finished product, although it keeps changing because of floods and beavers and everything, which is great. That's what we were hoping for. The biggest problem now, though, is that this is a project that's on a stream, and that stream is a huge source of a lot of invasive plants. So if you look at this photo, anything that's purple loosestrife. Most of the darker green there is narrowleaf cattails, and then the sort of fluffy stuff in a few places is Phragmites. And we've got a bunch of reed canary grass also. And really all 4 of those species just constantly come in no matter what we do. So we can do a lot of work to control those plants on the site, but we're always getting more in. And so where we're at right now is we've decided that we're going to manage for the habitat structure of the site. We're going to try to restrict invasives from becoming too bad, but every so often we're just going to take a block and we're basically just going to start over. So we'll herbicide it all out, we'll reseed it, and we'll just kind of have a moving window of that kind of restoring this site, because it's an important enough site for us that it's worth that work. And there's really nothing we can do. It's not worth us trying to every year patrol the entire site and kill every invasive because it's just not feasible. I'm not saying it's the right answer. That's the answer we're at right now. So I want to finish up by talking about how to measure success. And this relates, of course, to whatever objectives you have. And so here's an example of a site that we have where we've done 635 acres of cropland conversion with some wetlands in that mix. And one of the things we thought was important was our objective was to reconnect habitats, like that first objective that I talked about. So we knew we wanted to have high plant diversity because that impacts resilience. So we've done a bunch of work to see if species are showing up. And the answer to that is yes. We have very diverse seed mixes and we're finding the species that we put in there. And then the other thing is that species diversity maintaining itself over time? And the answer to that is also yes. Both the species richness and the floristic quality are maintaining themselves over time. So here's some data that's based on square meters. And you can see that it's pretty consistent after that initial establishment phase. We can also look at individual species across different sites and track the same thing, just making sure that nothing is disappearing. And it isn't. We have really good luck with that. But if the main objective is to reconnect sites or to make them make them larger and more functional, we also have to think about the animals. And so the objective was we want to make sure that the animals that are in those remnant prairies that we're trying to reconnect are actually moving into and using the restored habitat. And we've looked at this pretty opportunistically. Whenever we get an expert or a graduate student or somebody who's willing to help us, we do have them do some inventory work. And we just inventory the species that we find in the remnants versus what we find in the restored prairies. We've looked at small mammals and ants and grasshoppers and bees so far. And birds too. Birds are in a parentheses because to me, birds are easy. I know what I'm going to get for birds, and they relate more to the way we manage the site than to the way we restore the site. So we have birds, they're doing great, but I'm more worried about other things. And so far, those other 4 groups of animals are looking great. Like we're finding the vast majority of species that are in the remnant are showing up in the restoration, and we're seeing species in the restoration that we don't see in the remnant. So the sites actually complement each other in a really helpful way too. So we feel good about at least, we want to keep looking at this more, but we sort of feel like we've passed the first test. So if we have time and we find people to help us, we'd also like to look at how these animals are using them, how successful they are in breeding, all those sorts of things. But at least they're there, which is a good thing. And then honestly, we're trying to figure out what else we can measure that would help us evaluate the connectivity objective and the resilience objectives that we have. We have some ideas, but nothing very good beyond that. So at this point, we feel good that our plant community seems to be stable and that we have animals that are using the habitat we're trying to create. And now we just fight invasives and try to manage it, which is what my next presentation will be about if you end up coming to that. So I'm going to stop there. And here's some contact information for me or the work that we're doing here in the Nature Conservancy in Nebraska.
Chris?
Yep.
Yeah. Giving folks a little bit of time. They weren't having any questions currently in the chat, but we did kind of get that to folks a little bit late since we had that kind of stunted start, which is all on us. So cool to hear about some of the work you've been doing. Definitely, for sure. So I do have one question here. What are some of the large projects you have on private lands?
We're not really doing a lot of work on private lands. The restoration, the work that I do is all on Nature Conservancy land. We definitely work with people working on private lands, but everything that I'm doing is restoring our own lands. We do seed harvest for ourselves, and then we work on our own sites. But I will say, we've done, I think I mentioned we did a couple 100 acres at a time. We've done a few years of that scale. And then over time, that's added up to about 1,500 acres or so.
Nice. Very well. Another question here from Tracy. You mentioned restarting by burning down with herbicide. Have you tried any methods without using herbicide?
Yeah, and it depends on what we're trying to deal with. At the scale that we're working, so let's say 50 to 100 acres or 200 acres at a shot. If we have invasives that are perennials, or we have like deciduous woody trees or shrubs, I haven't found a lot of ways of doing it without herbicides. If you have a really small scale, you can certainly do things with black plastic or repeated tillage or something like that. But at a larger scale, something like glyphosate is honestly really hard to beat, just because it does a good job. It becomes inert once it hits the soil. It doesn't have long lasting consequences, and it can provide a really clean seed bed to get started with.
Thanks. Let's see. Carol has, how do you recruit volunteers to seed?
Boy, I wish I had a good answer for that. We have had limited success with volunteers. It kind of comes in pulses. We have volunteer days, work days every other Saturday, pretty much throughout the season. And if we get 4 or 5 people to show up, we're doing well. But we're a fair distance away from population centers. But that's not really enough of an excuse, I think. So we're trying to learn from people who are doing it better. And I think one of the things we picked up that we're going to try to really do more of is finding ways to empower volunteers and really give them a feeling of ownership over the project that we're working on. We tend to put them around on a lot of different sites and do a hodgepodge of different projects. And I think what we're planning now is we're going to say, okay, we're going to pick this site, and this is the site where volunteer work is going to add up to, and we're going to let volunteers sort of watch a project build in one place so that they feel like they can see their contributions and how they all add up. Whether that's going to work or not, I don't know, but that's the next thing we're going to try.
Yeah, we've definitely seen some success in those areas. I know with our volunteers here in Missouri.
Good.
Yeah. Let's see. So Tammy's asking, do you deal with ragweed or just let it go?
We don't worry about ragweed. Well, I say that. There have been a few examples, I think, where giant ragweed can be problematic if it canopies over and gets really dense. And it's probably one of the few things that I'll mow if we have big patches of it. But common ragweed, western ragweed, we don't worry about in our restorations or in our prairies, honestly. So it has to do with whether we have enough light coming through those plants. And we have drier sites than you have in Missouri and Kansas or eastern Kansas, and we have sandy soils, which also helps keep the density of those weeds down, which I think really makes it less important for us to deal with them.
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. How do the invasives you're working with respond to fire?
Variably. Things like smooth brome, tall fescue, Kentucky bluegrass, we can temporarily suppress them for a growing season at a time or so. And we combine that with grazing most of the time on our sites, and that makes a whole lot more difference. We're much more successful if we can use those two together. Things like deciduous shrubs, especially clonal shrubs like dogwood or sumac, you knock it back, but not for very long. So we're looking at other options with that, usually combinations of treatments. But I don't. In fact, as I talk now, I can't think of any invasive plants that we really worry about that fire alone will control. But it is a piece of the control for a lot of those.
Does anyone have any last questions? That's all we have in the chat at the moment. We'll give you just another minute maybe to finish typing in if somebody's typing in a question or so. Tracy made sure to tell people you take beautiful pictures of ragweed in the prairie and recommended following your blog there. Yeah.
Yeah, follow my blog, see ragweed pictures.
I have heard you have some awesome pictures in there, though. Awesome. Okay. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more photos. So thank you so much, Chris. Chris will be back with us at, let's see, at 4:00 for part 2. So if you want to join us then, you're happy to have y'all. The next, sorry, not at 4. Sorry, Chris, I'm trying to give you extra time. Chris's next session for part 2 is at 3 p.m. He will have some office hours at 4. So if you have other questions for him that come up and you're not able to attend next half of this session, you can join his office hours at 4. But part 2 of Chris's session, or if you need to go to someone else's, does begin at 3. So while you wait, you can check out our exhibitor chats, or at 3:30, we've got kind of a fun little session. I hear there's goodie bags or treats or something. I don't know what all's in there. But a couple of my staff are putting that on, so it should be a fun little session at 3:30. Sorry, 2:30. I swear I really am on Central Time. I'm just messing it all up. So make sure to check out your agenda in the Socio app so you know the real times that are happening. If you want to listen to Chris's session again at any time, it will be recorded. So it'll be on the Socio app that you can check out anytime in the next year. So thank you, Chris, very much. And I will see you again at 3 o'clock.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.